Hey everyone, and welcome back to the channel. My name is Coach Mart. Thank you so much for clicking on this video. So welcome to part D of this masterclass mini-series on the Caro-Kann defense from the black perspective. I'll make this intro short and sweet. So the first thing we're going to check out is the fourth major thing that white can play against the Caro-Kann, which is the fantasy variation. We have a secret sauce weapon that we'll use to fight against that. And the second part of the video, we're going to be talking about the ever popular Alien Gambit that has kind of taken the chess world by storm in the past couple of years. I'll show you all the main lines that you need to know to refute that very cool and popular gambit. And we'll finish up the video with a few knight sacrifice lines on f7 that are not part of the Alien Gambit. So without further ado, let's jump in.
And here we go.
Here we go, guys. So the fourth major thing that white can do against the Caro-Kann defense is the fantasy variation, and it looks like this. E4, C6, D4, D5. This is our normal setup. So in this mini series, in part A, we looked at the exchange variation. In part B, we looked at the advanced. Part C, we looked at the classical. And here in part D, we're going to look at the fantasy, which is F3. Now, early on, we learned that you're not really supposed to move your F pawn because it weakens the king on the diagonal. In this case, it actually is okay for white. I actually enjoy playing the fantasy against the Caro-Kann myself from the white side. It's a lot of fun to play, very aggressive, very tactical, a lot of good attacking ideas. The reason it gets its name fantasy is because white has literally a fantasy, a whole bunch of options and choices for how to attack. And if you haven't seen this from the black side, you can go wrong so many different ways. So before I give you guys my recommendation for how to fight against this, I do want to show you just a couple of very quick example lines so you can see how dangerous this can be for black. So we have takes, takes, and black has to push with E5. That's their only chance to try to bust open the center here. White just develops, black takes, white gets their bishop out, normal developing moves, and then black plays a very logical move with some discovered checks. White doesn't care, get the knight to G5, castle, and now the tactics start to flow. The floodgates just open. Boom, 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 boom. Queen comes down, the knight's pinned, and white picks up the bishop. Yikes, okay. Going back to this, if black just puts the bishop on E7, doesn't help. Boom, 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 boom. White just gets killed on this F file. The knight is lost.
But wait, there's more.
And let's say that black tries to pin that knight with bishop to G4 to stop all that. Doesn't help. Boom, boom, ouch. Knight E5 check with a discovered 2 against 1 here. King goes, and this is just absolutely disgusting, completely losing for black. So hopefully that's just a quick demonstration of why I'm not recommending that we go into this kind of stuff. All right, so our secret weapon is going to be, I guess we'll call it the anti-fantasy variation. So we're definitely not taking here. We're not playing E6. We're going to hit them with a gambit. We're going to play E5. And the purpose of E5 is to also blow up the center here. And what we want is we want white to take with the D pawn here, and that's going to open up this long dark square diagonal. And once this white pawn is out of the way, we are going to get our dark squared bishop and the queen lined up on this diagonal. And if white is not prepared for this, they can get into a lot of trouble. In fact, they can actually be checkmated in 7 moves. Another reason why I like this anti-fantasy variation is because it's very difficult for white to attack you. And a lot of times, actually, if white plays this correctly, their king is going to be in the center of the board. I still have very good success with it above 2,000. And I can almost promise you guys that nobody below 18, 1900, 2000, nobody below that is going to know how to handle this. So you're going to be in good shape if you can, try to memorize some of these main ideas. So let's go ahead and start off with some kind of tricks that we have on our end for black. And then at the end, I'll show you the best way. What do we do if white plays this like a machine? Okay, so we're going to hit them with E5. And they have 4 different main options that you'll see here. And the best one is for them to actually accept the gambit and to take on E5 here. But let's take a look at the other 3 main options if white does not play this correctly. I mean, by the way, if they don't accept the gambit, then in all variations, either black is equal or black is going to have a slight advantage. So let's say that they don't know what's going on here and they just take the pawn. Well, as I mentioned earlier, we don't want to move the f pawn because we're weak on this diagonal. Well, now that we've played the e pawn, we've gotten that out of the way, that frees up our queen to hit them with check on h4. And here, if they push, they either have to move their king or they have to block. And most likely, if they take this pawn, that means they don't really know what they're doing. So you already have them out of book. So they're logically going to play, you know, the first thing that comes to mind, which is block with a pawn. But now we take the d4 pawn. And in this position, I have never, ever seen somebody not exchange queens here. Because if they don't exchange queens, if they block, put some piece in front, then we're going to take, and then black is the one that has two beautiful pawns in the center. If they don't block, if they take a pawn or whatever, then we're going to take, their king can't castle anymore, and we're going to have rapid development, and we're going to be fine here. So almost every single time, they are going to exchange queens. From here, they have a couple of different options. They can either try to attack our pawn, or they can go ahead and take on c6. As always, we'll take a look at each of these different variation branches. So let's say that they play knight to e2, attacking our pawn. No big deal. We just push. We push c5. And already it's very, very equal. I mean, white has a small advantage here, but in order for them to keep any kind of advantage, they have to play this weird move, either knight to a3, or they have to play c4. If they do play c4, I'm not going to really talk about that, but if they play c4 here, we do not take en passant. They play c4, we have a protected pass pawn, they have a protected pass pawn, and it's pretty equal from there. But if you get to this point and white finds the move knight a3, that's incredibly impressive because they've already misplayed this. So the idea behind knight a3 is eventually at some point maybe they want to come down here, and there's some ideas of forking here on c7. So you're just going to have a very good game from here. Engine says this is plus 0.2 for white. Going back a few moves to this spot. So what if they go ahead and take on c6 here with the pawn? That's kind of what we hope for because we're going to take back with the knight. And I'll stop the line here. There's several different things that white can do, of course, but black is already equalized, and actually black has a small advantage here. So the C2, remember this, the C2 pawn is going to be a target for black in a lot of these lines. So remember the move bishop to f5. Depending on what white does here, bishop f5 will be strong to hit the pawn. Otherwise, we can just develop knight to f6, bishop to e7, and castle. In some rare variations, maybe we get our knight to b4, our bishop to f5, and now we turn the tables. It'll almost be like the exact mirror image of what I was showing you guys from the white side a little bit earlier. And so we kind of flipped the script there. Also, in a lot of lines, it's perfectly fine if black wants to consider castling long. Sometimes in some of these lines I'm going to show you, the king will actually be on the d file, so we're going to want to castle long, sometimes even with check. So black should have a very good game here. Engine says this is minus 0.2 for black. Going back to the start, so we just took a look at what happens if they take our d pawn. Next, let's look at another situation where they don't accept the gambit here. So if they play knight c3, bishop e3, obviously they can make a move with one of these minor pieces. You're just never going to see it. But the easy way that I remember this is they do not make a pawn move from the start of our anti-fantasy variation. If they don't take that pawn or don't take this pawn, we are always going to take their e4 pawn. So if they play knight c3, we're going to take the e4 pawn. They have two different ways to recapture here. Most logical way is for them to capture with their f pawn, but now we just take on d4, and this is actually losing for white. The knight is hit. They're going to have to back it up. We're going to push c5. Yeah, so just like we talked about at the very beginning of this masterclass, we've seen that c5 push all throughout the mini-series, and a lot of times it comes at moments when you least expect it. Here is pretty obvious, but that's such a critical part of the Caro-Kann in general. Let's say they try to break open our structure, break open the center with c3. Doesn't matter. We just play knight c6, and white is lost. If they take, we're going to take back with a pawn, and we have a protected pass pawn in the center of the board that can't be challenged with another pawn. Their e-pawn is incredibly weak, and black is just going to enjoy a very good central controlled position here. Engine says this is minus 1.9, a great way to fight against the fantasy. Back to this spot where white had a choice which pawn to take. So this time, let's say they take our e-pawn. The queens are in tension with each other, so we are going to exchange queens. They can take with the king, it's playable, but probably they'll take with the knight. We do not want to take this f3 pawn because we are helping them develop their knight. We're going to leave that. We're going to develop our knight to d7. And now they have a choice. They can either push their f-pawn or they can take our e-pawn. If they do take the e-pawn, then we take their e-pawn, and it's pretty equal. Very tiny margin for black, but black is going to enjoy playing against this isolated king's pawn. So here, pretty much no matter what white does, we're going to play bishop to d6. If they get the knight out, we'll just play bishop to d6, knight to f6, castle, and black's going to should have no problems here. Engine says this is minus 0.1 for black. Okay, back to this spot where they had a couple options. Now this time, let's say they push the pawn to f4. Well, now we're going to get out our tools and we're going to start our normal undermining process. So let's start chipping away at white's pawn chain. So we hit them with f6. And once again, they got a couple of options here. Let's say that they take that. Well, we simply take back with our knight and develop. And check out the development here, guys. So white has one piece that is developed while black has 1, 2, 3, 4 pieces developed. The material is even, so obviously black is way ahead in development and has a very nice advantage here. Engine says this is minus 0.6 for black. Okay, going back a move, if they push their pawn to e6, well, we just go and attack it. Knight to c5, and if they try to hold on to that, guess what? More chiseling. Yep, just trying to chip away and bust open that pawn chain. They have 2 more options. If white takes that, then they're busted because black's going to play f5 and they can't hold on to this pawn. We have a protected pass pawn all the way up the board already here on move 10, and the engine says this is completely dominating for black, minus 2.3. All right, back another move, and what if they try to hold on to that pawn by pushing g4? Here, guys, you will not believe what we play here. You'll never guess it. Oh, okay. Maybe you will guess it. Guess what? More chiseling. We are just stubborn mules. We are going to break down their pawn chain no matter what. If they take that, then we take their g-pawn, and these pawns are pretty dangerous. Look at this, guys. They got it going on. They're all the way up in our territory, deep into our house, almost promoting, and we will speak fondly of them at their funeral very soon. Engine says this is minus 2.2 for black. Good try, white. Obviously, going back to this spot, if they were to take that, then we would take here, and this pawn is incredibly weak, and we know that they can't play this kind of move. This is just kind of an amateur type move because the pawn is pinned to the rook. Everything is losing here. Okay, back to the beginning. So those were all of the lines with knight to c3. The last thing we need to take a look at before we get into the main lines is bishop to e3. And here again, if they do not take one of these pawns, we're going to take their e4 pawn every single time. I've never seen this before. I mean, obviously you just trade queens and that's going to be very good for black. So from here, they're going to take our e pawn, and because they've moved their f pawn, that diagonal is open. We're going to slide in with queen to h4 check. 99% of the time, they're going to block with the bishop. I will show you this g3 line just for grins and giggles. I've never seen it before. In all the years I've been doing this, never seen it. If they push g3, we're going to take e4, and now their bishop is hit and their rook is hit, and it's a very funny line. So they play queen e2, we take the rook, and now our queen is basically trapped. They play bishop g2, we take the pawn, and tactics recognition, this is an undefended piece. White has this very nice idea, but you know what? It's actually good for black. We sacrifice our queen, take on d4, and this is losing for white. Black can easily develop. It's like minus 1.6 or something like that. So crazy line. You're going to see that maybe 1 out of 200 times. So anyway, I just thought I'd throw that out there. Kind of a funny line. So if we go back to this spot, they're going to block with a bishop every single time. We're going to take on e4 with check, and now black is going to be up a pawn no matter what white does. If they block with the queen, we'll exchange queens. If they throw some other piece in front, then we'll simply take on d4 and black is up a pawn. So as you might expect, the engine says this is minus 0.9 for black. And now comes the part in our regular broadcast where we will be discussing the main lines of this anti-fantasy variation. Everything we have seen up until this point have been lines that you're likely to see from players, I don't know, maybe between 1,000 and 1,200 and below. Players above that will probably understand the best way to play this is to accept the gambit by taking on e5. So here we have the green light to go ahead and get our queen and bishop on this long dark square diagonal. The move order doesn't really matter too terribly much. We can bring out the queen first. White has three main things they're likely to do from here. Knight c3 is the best. I will save that for last and take a look at some of the lines where white could get in trouble first. White's thinking, well, I already won a pawn on e5. I might as well continue gobbling up pawns. So they take our d pawn. That's a mistake. We're going to ignore that. Play bishop to c5, and now we're double attacking the knight on g1. So a lot of times white will just continue gobbling up pawns and they won't notice that their knight is hanging on g1 and you'll just win a piece there. So, but from here, let's say that white does notice that the knight is being hit. Let's say that they move the knight to e2. We have a nice sequence of moves here. We're going to play bishop to f2 check. The king has to go to d2, and now we can bring our queen in to e3 check. And if you let the engine sit here and think for a while, if you let it get to a depth of like 3,412, the engine evaluation will actually say this is
Game over.
Yeah, so this is the 7-move checkmate. And I promise, guys, you will see this. I promise you'll see this at some of the lower levels. And I've won a ton of games in this exact line. So, yeah, your opponent, white's going to be like, another failed fantasy opening. And back to this spot. So I have this in my software because my opponent played this against me when the very first time I was ever introduced to these anti-fantasy lines. My opponent played this against me and I definitely misplayed it. They played queen to e2 and I didn't know what to do here. And I definitely did not play this correctly. And I actually have seen this a few times since then. So I thought I would include it in the video. And white is just simply leaving the knight hanging on g1. And this is not quite as trivial as the other time when we just had it. This is actually a little bit tricky. So we do take the knight and they pushed e6. And I got a little bit scared here because I wasn't sure what to do. I think I actually pushed f6 and then they pushed d6 and it got very, very muddy down here, and I actually ended up losing the game, and I wasn't sure what to do because I thought, you know, I don't really want to have to move my king. And I went back and looked at the engine, and it's like, our king is incredibly safe on f7. There's no way to attack it. So the move here is just take the d pawn. They take our f pawn, and there's no way for white to attack this king. It is incredibly safe. And now we're threatening to get the knight out and pin the queen to the king. And so they develop, we develop our knight. They have to get their king off the E line. We bring the rook, we hit the queen. They've got to sidestep that. We develop and white is busted. We're going to bring the king back. This guy is safe and we're just way, way ahead. So I'll never make that mistake again. Engine says this is -5 for black. Okay, so if white allows themselves to get into this bind, then the better players will probably play the correct or the best move, which is to develop their knight to h3. As you would imagine, we're going to snap that off. They take. Now from here, we're going to give a check on f2, and the king has a couple of squares to go to. If they go to d2, then we're right back to a checkmate in 8 moves again. I have seen that maybe once or twice, but they have to bring their king forward. And now we're going to take the d pawn, and white will usually play 2 different moves here. If they play knight to c3, then we have a very nice move. We're going to bring our bishop back to d4, and we're setting a trap by allowing white to take the d5 pawn.
It's a trap!
If they fall for it and take it, well, tactics recognition, condition number 2, the knight is a 0 versus 0, is undefended, And condition number 3 checks. You betcha queen to b5. That forks the knight and the king. Now, on the surface, it looks like maybe white can get out of this by blocking with the queen and then pushing the c-pawn. But we always look for checking moves, right? Especially when you're in trouble. We simply take the e-pawn with check. And we end up getting to keep our extra piece. And white is busted. Engine says this is -4 for black. Jumping back, if white does not fall for the trap and they simply push their pawn to f4, then we will defend our pawn with knight to e7. And strange enough, white's king is pretty out in the open. The correct move for white to play to maintain equality is to actually put their king on f3. Strange looking move, but just kind of get out of the middle, get off of the e file and get out from the center of the board. Here we're simply going to capture their knight. We're going to double their pawns. And then we're going to castle. And I'll stop the line here. Very interesting position. It actually is okay for white, mostly because they have the bishop pair. But the compensation is white has 2 sets of double pawns. And the position is a little bit open, so the bishops do thrive in open positions. But white's king is way out in the center, and this is going to be pretty tactical from here. So, you know, black's going to develop their knight, bring their rooks to the central files, and black should have no problems. I would much rather play this from the black side. If we flip this around, I mean, yeah, we got the bishop coming here. That looks good, but man, this does not look very safe. So very, very sharp position from here. Engine says this is plus 0.1 for white. Rewinding to this spot, so let's say white does not play knight to c3, but rather takes the pawn on d5. We're simply going to develop the knight to c6. White has a couple of choices. If they develop the knight to c3, then we have this weird, actually, if they play knight to c3 or knight to a3, we're going to play this very strange looking bishop to g1. What is all this about? Well, that simply clears the f2 square for the queen. If the queen gets in there to check, that's going to be pretty devastating. Not to mention the fact that we just walked into the rook's bedroom and put this poor rook, locked him in his own closet. Hey! And he probably doesn't appreciate that too much. So from here, white needs to defend this f2 square, so they'll play knight to e4. We're going to hit the queen, and I'll stop the line here. White's in big trouble because they have no way to defend this e5 pawn. They either have to give up the queen or lose e5. And once that falls, the king's going to be right in the middle of the board. So looking very, very good here for black. Engine says this is minus 0.9 for black. So let's say that white realizes that e5 is going to be a weakness and they try to protect it with the f4 push. This is no good. We're going to play rook to d8, hit that queen. The best move is for the queen to drop back to e4. And now we're going to drop the bishop back to h4. Once again, we've renewed the threat of queen f2 check. And they can't block with a bishop because b2 falls. That is a huge problem. And in this position, white is just busted. Engine says this is minus 3.7 for black. So now we're going to finish up these anti-fantasy lines after white accepts the gambit with the main continuation, which is knight c3. And white's plan is very simple. Once black brings their bishop to c5, they simply want to fork us. We're going to continue the plan. It's not a problem. We're going to give a check here on f2 with the bishop. The king can't go here because, once again, that would be checkmate. So the king has to come up. We're going to play queen to d4 and offer a trade of queens. White is going to accept that. We're going to take back with the bishop. And you'll notice that white is up a pawn here. And white has a couple of different options. The best option is to push the pawn to f4. Now, if you get to this spot and your opponent finds the f4 push while completely ignoring the e4 pawn, and so that black can just take it, then one of two things. Either they're using an engine or they're a very good player and they just have all this memorized. So let's first take a look at what happens if they take our d pawn, because that's pretty good news, because that means white is now out of book. So we are simply going to capture back on e5. They're going to take our pawn. We're going to take their pawn. And once again, white is still up a pawn. They have a couple of moves here. Let's say that they kick our bishop with pawn to f4. No problem. We drop the bishop back to c7, and black is just better. White is up a pawn here, but their king is in the center of the board. And we have very easy development. Black can consider castling long, castling short. And remember this, guys. I alluded to this at the very beginning of the video. Remember this c2 pawn. Pretty much from here, whatever white does, we're going to play bishop to f5. And we're going to be putting a lot of pressure on this c2 pawn. So nice healthy advantage here for black. Engine says this is minus 0.6. Going back a move, so if white develops their bishop to e3, then we're going to develop our knight to e7, and this is a completely equal position. And black has one main goal here. They want to get their bishop to f5, as we've already talked about, and they want to get this knight to the d5 square. So that we have both of these pieces putting some pressure on this c2 square. Engine says this is completely even across the board. And let's finish up with this very last theoretical line. So if white is booked up, they will push pawn to f4, leaving this pawn to be taken. We will take it. They will bring their bishop down to e3. We will exchange bishops, and their king is going to go on a little journey here. We're going to try to break open the structure with f6. They're going to take our pawn. We take their pawn. They take back, and their king is in the center of the board. So I don't think that's really what we mean when we say the three opening principles, trying to control the center of the board. I don't think this is like, what is it called? King of the hill, where you're trying to get your king to these four squares in the center of the board. So it's kind of funny. We're going to develop knight to e7. And now we're threatening to play bishop f5 check and hit that c2 pawn once again. So amazingly enough, the best move is for the king to go backwards and to back up to e3 so they don't lose that c2 pawn. So this is the only line that I've shown you so far in this video where white has a decent advantage if they play like a computer here. They are up this pawn in the center of the board, but black has the safety of castling. Their king is in the center. We're going to bring our bishop to f5, and if you're a tactical player, you still have some very good chances here. So I play this exact line. I usually, my opponent and I will blitz out these first 14, 15 moves. We'll reach this point, and it's not easy for white to hold on to this pawn, but in my humble opinion, it sure beats trying to play against the normal fantasy where you're always under pressure and stress, not knowing what kind of crazy sacrifice lines that white has in the normal fantasy. So I'm perfectly fine playing a pawn down here. I personally am a very aggressive player. I like gambits. I don't want to sit back and play passively and just sit there and defend. I actually like this position. We're going to castle, maybe even castling long, develop our pieces, and white has a lot of weaknesses. They're a little bit behind in development here, so no problem at all for me, in my opinion. Engine says this is plus 0.6 for white. All right, so that's it for the anti-fantasy variation. Welcome back. I hope you guys were able to use the restroom during that extended break if you needed to. So before I go on to the next section, I want to go all the way back in time and take a look and refresh our memory on something that I talked about in the very first video that I ever put out on this channel in the Beginner to Master series and Fundamentals of Chess, and that is, which of black's pawns do you think is the weakest at the very start of the position? If you've never heard of this, or if you don't know this, go ahead and pause the video. Which of black's pawns is the weakest? Pause now. Okay, so it's the f7 pawn. So why is that the weakest? Well, it's the only pawn in black's camp that's only protected by the king. So a lot of openings will focus on the weakness of that f7 square. And I'll give you, there are a whole bunch, but I'll just give you a few examples here. So one is the 4-move scholar's checkmate that probably every chess player learns very early on when they're introduced to the game. We also have the Danish Gambit, where white sacrifices a pawn in the opening for rapid development to get their pieces lined up towards the enemy king, towards that f7 square. We have the Legal trap, where white actually sacrifices their queen for a forced mating sequence. Very, very cool trap. We have the Leonhardt Gambit that stems out of the Scandinavian defense, where white can win black's queen if black does not play that correctly. And then even earlier in this video, we have the fantasy variation, right, where all of white's pieces are focused on that weak f7 square. And now we get to add to the list the Alien Gambit.
What?
Right. So the idea is white wants to sacrifice their knight on that weak f7 square. What is this garbage trash opening about? Just kidding. Actually, it's quite a very ingenious, impressive idea in Gambit that a young up and comer popular online YouTube streamer who goes by the name Witty Alien, of course, came up with back in 2022 and really took the chess world by storm in 2023. So, got to give him credit. Very impressive. It's kind of like that game that I play with Anna Cramling, where she played the cow against me, which is an opening that she created and invented. So, really cool to see young people coming up with new concepts and ideas, even though chess has been around for about 1,500 years. So, what is the Alien Gambit? Well, it's in this video, so of course it comes out of the Caro-Kann opening and actually stems from the classical variation where white brings their knight out and we play knight f6, which is my main recommendation. They play knight to g5, we attack it, and they sacrifice on f7. So this actually is the start of the Alien Gambit, and it's played at all levels. I mean, even above the 2000 level, I'm playing this relatively pretty often, probably 1 out of 20, 30 games at the lower time controls. So it is very tricky. Of course, it's dubious for white, and white is losing if black plays this correctly. But it is quite dangerous and very tricky. So there are lots of different traps. Before I go into all of the different correct refutation lines, I do want to show you a couple of the ideas that white is hoping for. And one of those is simply bringing out their knight. And as a lot of times in the Caro-Kann, black might want to pin it. And this is immediately losing because of this same idea, the concept of the weak f7 square. White has the nice check on e5, and all of a sudden the bishop on g4 is lost. White is attacking it with the knight and the queen, and yep, white is already winning. Here's another idea. So white brings their knight out. Instead of pinning it, black brings their bishop out to f5. White gives a check. Black blocks with a pawn. White gives the check on e5. And then they hit us with g4. Very aggressive way to play. If the bishop goes to e4, then white simply sacrifices, or they take on e6 first, and then white sacrifices the rook. They just push the pawn. If black takes that rook, and it's checkmate, game over. That's another pretty interesting line. And then finally we have this one where black plays e6 instead of bringing the light bishop out. Some developing moves. White gets the rook to the e file, and white tries to escape. And white gives this check here on e5, and black snaps that off. And now this knight on f6 has to move, and now the game is pretty much over because white brings their queen in, and then they sacrifice on h6. And this is actually very similar to some of the Tartakower lines that we talked about earlier in this miniseries, where black wants to sacrifice on the h3 pawn. Well, here white sacrifices on h6, and just like we talked about in the Tartakower, white wants to do this rook lift and bring it over to the G file, and this is lights out for black. So, of course, we're not going to go in for any of that nonsense. And if you don't remember anything else that I say in this whole section of the Alien Gambit, you got to remember this guy. Yep, we can never forget our good buddy and pal, Mr. C5 Push. We've seen that all throughout the Caro-Kann miniseries. You might say, yeah, but we play a lot of the same normal moves like knight f6, but there's something about this c5 push that seems to pop up in moments when you least expect it or might not otherwise normally be on your radar. And it's almost like we've gotten to the point where when in doubt, push c5, right? Because it's almost never a bad move. It's not natural. We're taught not to move the same piece twice in the opening, but this is the correct way to play it. So the c5 push is the most important move in this entire refutation. Guys, if you do not push c5 in the Alien Gambit, you will get smoked. The reason for that is white wants to bring their knight out to e5 and check the king, right? So we never want to allow this knight to get comfortable on this e5 square. So we want to push c5 to either dislodge this pawn or to put pressure and stress on the d4 pawn. So as always, on the notes on the right there, I have several rules for you to follow. I like to give you guys rules. It's easier to remember what to do when you have rules to lean on in your chess toolbox. One of them is the king is always going to retreat to the g8 square in the Alien Gambit. Never, ever, ever e8. Next rule to follow is if and when white ever plays c3, after we have c5 pushed, when they play c3 to defend the d4 pawn, we are going to take that every single time. The last thing to remember is the good news about the Alien Gambit is white only has two options, knight f3 and bishop to c4. So it's not a lot to memorize from this original starting position. So the rule is if they bring their knight out to f3 first, we are immediately going to push c5. If they bring the bishop out first and give us a check, then we have authorization to block with the light squared bishop. And if you get this move order wrong, you can get into some trouble. So let's say that they bring the knight out and you play some other random move, and now they check you with the bishop. You cannot block with the bishop because of this nasty check on e5. And now the king has to go back, and white is winning. And this is just another one of the ideas that white is hoping for with this gambit. Okay, so let's go ahead and dig into some of these lines. And a lot of the things that I'm going to show you guys are lines that I have put in to my repertoire simply based on experience. I mean, I have studied some of the main lines, but if I've seen, in the past couple of years, if I've seen the same tricks and the same lines over and over, I'll throw it into the repertoire and the software and train on it. So let's go ahead and start off with some of these knight f3 variations. And what do we play here? Say it with me, YouTube. c5. Yes, sir. From here, white has four different things that we'll take a look at. Let's say that they go ahead and give us the check on c4 with the bishop. What's our rule? Do we block with the bishop? Nope. We only block when this bishop comes out first. If the knight has already developed to f3, we do not block with the bishop because then we have the same thing that we're just talking about, right? And we end up losing the bishop. So that doesn't work. So we are going to push with e6 to block. And here there are two moves that you're equally likely to see with the immediate check with the knight or castling. Let's say that they choose to castle first. And now we're going to start putting immediate pressure on that d4 pawn. So we're going to develop our knight to c6. Our knight almost always comes to c6 in the Alien Gambit. Very rarely does it ever come to d7. I think there might be one line where I show you that. And white can never push this because we just simply have too many attackers on that square. So let's say from here, and also one more thing, white can never really trade because the only hope for white is for them to keep the queens on the board for checkmate. So if they were to ever trade here, we would gladly take the queens off the board and white is down a piece and black would basically have nothing to worry about. So here, pretty much every single time they're going to defend that with c3. What's our rule? When these pawns are in tension and they play c3, we take that every single time. Okay, so from here, we are going to play bishop to d6. And let's say that white puts their rook on the e file. Now, I didn't put this in the notes, but this is kind of another side mini rule, I guess you could say. If and when this e pawn is double attacked by the rook and the bishop, then we will bring our rook to e8. If the bishop is the only thing that's defending the e6 pawn, then we will bring our rook to f8 and drop our king back to g8. So here, yes, they are double attacked. So we cannot play rook to f8 and bring the king back. So we will play rook to e8. From here, I'll go ahead and stop the line. I mean, black has a very, very good setup here, and white is completely lost. Another common theme, I can't necessarily say this is a rule, but another common theme, especially when there's pressure on e6, is for black to throw their knight into d5 because that's going to break up the communication with anything on the e file, a rook or a queen, with this bishop. And white does not have a pawn on the e or the c files if they've already traded on d4. So when this knight gets to d5, it is a tremendous blockader of this pawn and breaking up the communication with the bishop here. So perfectly fine for black. Engine says this is minus 2.6, our first Alien Gambit failure. Back to this spot. So by the way, should I put a tally counter on the screen just to keep track of all the failed Alien Gambit attempts, just kind of for grins and a couple of giggles?
Do it.
You got it. Well, there's our first one. So let's say that they do now hop the knight in and give us a check here on e5. Our rule is to go back to the g8 square. Let's say they play c3. Again, what is our rule? When these pawns are in tension, we always capture on d4. We take, they take. And now we're going to put maximum pressure on d4, knight to c6. This will be a common idea in a lot of lines. So from here, A thing that you'll see, this is a common idea that you'll see in some lines where white gets their knight to g6, putting pressure on our rook, and sometimes we play rook to h7, and white maybe wants to try to put pressure on the rook. But now you're going to be very, very happy. You'll give yourself a pat on the back because you played c5 early on, and now what does that allow? Bishop b4 check, and white is in big, big trouble here. So they either have to play king to f1 or they have to block with the bishop. If they do block with the bishop, then we're simply going to trade here and get rid of one less minor piece. Queen takes d4. And now if they exchange, we're threatening to trade pretty much everything off the board. So now if they take our bishop, we do not trade queens. We find the better move, which is to take c4. Now their bishop is hit. Yes, they're still hitting our rook, but their king is wide open. They need to do something about this, and then we can think about saving our rook. And white is completely busted here. And the engine says this is, going back to this spot, minus 3.3 for black. Jumping back to the start of the knight f3 lines, that's what happens when they play bishop to c4 check immediately. What if they give us a check with the knight first immediately? Well, we're likely going to transpose to what we just saw. It's just a difference in move order. Our rule is to go back to g8. Now they'll give us the check with the bishop. We're going to block with e6. They're going to push c3. We know what to do by now. We're going to take that. They take knight c6, and we're right back to where we were. If they play knight to g6, then we have this bishop b4 check. So going back to the start of this position here, if they give us the check with the knight first or with the bishop first, it doesn't really matter. We're probably going to transpose to the same thing. So no reason to go through the engine analysis there. That is the third failed attempt. Yep, back to this spot. So we've taken a look at both of these checks. What if white plays the immediate c3? Of course, we're going to take. And the reason why they would do this is because they want to perhaps open up their queen and bishop on this light square diagonal, or at least get their queen to b3 to give some pressure here. And in this position, I was trying to come up with a, I'm a teacher, right? So I'm trying to come up with a silly way to help you guys remember this, because this is the only line where I'm going to show you where we actually do play bishop to f5. So I was thinking, what is a silly way to remember this? The only thing I could come up with is after these exchanges and we get all these pawns out of the way, it's a pretty open position, right? So my silly little way is the king is live, right? It's wide open in the center. The king's in play. It's live. So we play bishop f5. Yeah, that's all I got for you. Okay, so in this position, we actually are going to gambit a pawn here. This is what we're hoping for. So queen b3 check. We're going to block that with e6. We're going to allow them to take on b7 with check. It looks scary. No problem. They're forking the king and the rook here. No problem. We just develop the one time where we're going to play knight to d7 instead of developing our knight to c6. And then from here, I've seen this line several times. They're going to bring their bishop to c4 and put some pressure here. And now white's just lost. We simply just play queen to c8. And that's it. Game over. There's no way for white to hold on to this bishop and avoid trading queens at the same time. If they try something like queen to b5, we play rook to b8. And this is it. That's just game over. What do they do here? They're gonna lose something. If they try to go here, well, that looks like a really good move. We have something even stronger. Throw in the check, block up the communication, and if they defend like this, we just take the bishop, and this is just horrible. So none of that works. So once we play queen to c8 in this position, there is zero attack here for white. So the engine says this is minus 3.6 for black. Traveling back to this spot, so before white recaptures on d4 with the c3 pawn, they can bring out their queen or bishop early. So let's take a look at those two lines. If they bring the queen out first to b3 check, then notice we don't have our bishop on f5 yet. We are going to block with the e pawn. They're going to give us a check on e5 with the knight. We slide back to g8, and they bring in the bishop. And it looks like there's a lot of pressure on e6. But every time there is pressure on e6, we play the same move. We just throw the knight in front, knight d5. And now white has no recourse. The attack is gone. They can take the d pawn, but we just develop knight to c6. And black has a lot of positional threats here. We're threatening to either trade one of white's best attacking pieces. We're hitting d4. We're threatening bishop to d6 here. I will note that we're not threatening knight to a5, because if we play knight to a5, then white swings their queen over to f3, and ooh, that's going to hurt on f7. We cannot let white into our house no matter how many times they knock. So, but outside of that, after knight c6, we're in great position here. Engine says this is minus 3.2 for black. And if white brings out the bishop first here, this is yet another little trap that white is hoping for. We're going to block that with the e6 pawn again, and white's going to castle. And notice there has been tension between the d and the c pawns for a couple of moves here. White is hoping that we won't see it and that we will take the pawn and we'll just lose our queen. But we are rated 3,400. We are too smart for that. So we are going to develop the bishop to d6 that we've seen now for a second time, and now we are threatening to take on c3. So now they'll take it, and once again we have this decision. Does white have two pieces attacking e6? Using our little mini rule, and the answer is no. So when the rook is already here, yes, we'll bring the rook to e8 to support, but since they only have one attacker, now the rook goes to f8. And now if they bring the rook in to hit e6, we're going to play this same move that we've been playing now several times. Just throw that knight into d5 and break up this communication on e6. From here, white can literally move their queen to either of these two squares. It does not matter. Let's say they go to c2, and now we swing the queen into f6, and that's it. White has absolutely no attack here. And guys, you might not see any of these lines ever, but at least you're seeing the same concepts over and over. Throwing the knight into d5, bringing the king back to g8. And a lot of times you'll notice that this bishop remains on c8. At the very start of this Alien Gambit, I showed you how white got in trouble by bringing the bishop out early. But we've only brought this bishop out to f5 one time when the queen got to b3. But as long as you keep this bishop here eyeing down the e6 pawn here, then and you play c5, white doesn't have anything in these knight f3 lines. So Engine agrees and says that the evaluation is minus 2.9 for black. Dropping back to this spot, so we've taken a look at the two checks with the two minor pieces. We've looked at the c3 push, and now let's check out the last thing that you'll see here, which is white pushing their pawn to the d5 square. And that's just a flat-out blunder because we have two attackers and they only have one defender. So that is a free pawn.
I'll share a little secret with you. This is no ordinary pawn. It's a magic hanging pawn.
A free pawn?
Yes.
So for those of you who are not familiar, that is the poisoned apple scene from the movie Snow White, which was Disney's first original movie ever created back in the year 1697, starring my wife and daughter, who are actually up for Emmy nominations this year for voice acting. So if you don't know the story, Snow White ends up taking and eating the poison apple from the evil witch and she dies. And that's exactly what will happen to you if you take that pawn. If you take it with the knight, well, tactics recognition conditions 1 and 2, pieces lined up on the same straight line, and the queen is undefended. She's a 0-0, white pushes c4, and the knight is lost. Black ends up having to play e6, and black had a huge advantage before being greedy and taking that pawn on d5, and now they just threw it all away. Yeah, and going back even worse, if black takes this with the queen, trying to trade queens, white has an amazing move here. I'll give you guys a chance to see if you can find it. I'll even flip the board around for you. It is white to play. What would you play here? Pause now. Yeah, so tactics recognition, condition number 1, again, location of the pieces, the color of squares, pieces being on the same straight line. White has the amazing bishop c4, pinning the queen to the king, and the queen is lost. If you take that, light, light, light. Ouch. Guys, please do not learn this lesson the hard way. So if we go back, anytime that you see a free pawn on the D file in the Alien Gambit, and you're thinking,
maybe I can win a pawn,
just remember, friend, do not take the poison pawn. So what do we do instead? We simply drop the king back to g8. And white doesn't have much here. You're likely to see bishop to c4 with a whole bunch of discovered checks and attacks on the king. And here, guys, we have an amazing move. We don't like this guy. Let's get rid of him. Boom, push b5. And this is a beautiful little decoy tactic. If they take that, then whoops, that's going to hurt. That wins another piece for black, and that's game over. They can't really afford to drop the bishop back because it gets trapped. And so if they drop the bishop back here, we simply push e6, and white is busted. They're either going to have to trade queens or they can't push it. We have 2 attackers on that. So if they don't trade queens, they're going to have to be okay with black repairing their pawn structure. And black has an amazing center here, and there's nothing that white can do. Engine says this is completely lost for white and is minus 2.0. Okay, so that was a handful of most of the main lines that you're going to see from the starting position of the Alien Gambit when white plays knight to f3. Now we're going to change and shift our focus to the bishop check on c4 first. Well, the knight has not developed to f3, so we do have the green light to go ahead and block with the bishop. White has 2 options here to drop it back or to exchange. If they do exchange, our king is walking out to the center of the board. We're trying to play king of the hill and see if we can get to the middle the fastest. Just kidding. They're going to develop their knight. And guess where our king goes? All the way back to its safe haven. Check. Go all the way back to g8, right? King is very, very safe there. If they play this knight to g6, our rook is incredibly happy on the h7 square because the light squared bishops are off the board. So it'll camp out there until the dust settles. Let's say white castles. We just play knight to d7. And I'll stop the line here. There's nothing. There's no attack here. Probably most likely black will play e6 or maybe queen e8 to put some pressure on this knight. And white has nothing here. The engine says this is minus 2.5 for black. All right, hopping back to this spot. So white really needs to keep this light squared bishop on the board. It's one of their best attacking pieces. So after the gambit, you'll notice that the king is going to be on light squares, especially if somebody doesn't know not to go back to the e8 square. So you'll probably see the exchange on e6 a low percentage of the time. So you'll probably likely see them back it up to d3. And guess what we're going to do here, guys? You'll never guess it. So after the c5 push and white takes, this is white's last ace in the hole, their last trick up their sleeve. And what white is hoping for is maybe black plays bishop to g4, hitting the queen. Maybe black plays g5, or maybe black's king retreats back to its safe haven on g8. And this is like a 3-move delayed decoy. If any of those moves happen, ouch. We have the check on g6, and the queen is lost. So that is why after we push c5, white is actually hoping for this. They actually want to take so that they can free up the queen here with any kind of check on the light squares, right? So even if the king goes back to g8, it still doesn't work. That's still a check on the light square, and our queen is lost. So definitely got to remember that one. So after the push and the exchange, all we have to do here, guys, is we just have to move this knight. This knight literally can go to all 3 of these available squares, and they're all 3 equally playable. So it's just kind of a personal opinion. I probably like knight to c6 just to kind of blockade this pawn. But as soon as you move this knight, obviously the queen is not undefended anymore. So white is out of luck here. And the engine says this is minus 3.1 for black. All right, guys. So that's all I wanted to cover for the Alien Gambit. Obviously, I might not have covered every single line, but those are the 9 main ones that I've seen the most often in the past couple of years. They say a cat has 9 lives. Well, we just went through all of white's 9 lives, and they are fresh out of luck. So hopefully you remember some of the common themes that we're going to play with the c5 push, getting the knight to d5, the king retreating to g8, all of those same things. Yeah, let me know in the comments if you guys are able to refute this Alien Gambit in some of your games. I'd love to hear about it. All right, so we're going to wrap up this video with some other knight sacrifice lines on f7 outside of the normal Alien Gambit. Okay, so I have 3 more lines that I want to show you guys with knight sacrifices on f7. And this is still going to stem out of the Caro-Kann, but on move 2, white's going to play knight f3, which you will see a lot, and nothing changes on our end. They get the second knight out. This is called the 2 knights attack that I'll go into a little bit more detail in part E of this mini-series. We're still going to take, they're going to take. We still play knight f6, and this looks very similar to the Alien Gambit, but the difference is there's a knight on f3 instead of white playing d4. So if they do come down and immediately give us a check, we go back to our safe haven on g8. They give us a check with a bishop. We block with e6. And now if they play d4, well, we transpose right back into the Alien Gambit. And what do we play here? Yep, and this is a carbon copy, and we know what to do from here. So now we're going to introduce another side variation, which is white takes on f7, and they give us the immediate check. But now instead of bringing the bishop to c4 and transposing to the alien gambit, they play this immediate knight to g6. Obviously, they're hitting the rook there. And here we're going to play a move that you probably would not think to play, but makes a lot of sense after you see it. And the move is queen to d5. Now, what in the world is this move about? This has one purpose only, and that is to stop bishop to c4. So we actually are going to allow white to take our rook here, because if that bishop gets to c4, it's big, big trouble. So here white can take our rook, and we do not immediately take back. We throw in this intermezzo check, and white can obviously block with either piece. If they block with the bishop, this is kind of a funny line here. They're hanging the g2 pawn. We take that. They play bishop to f3, hitting our queen. We drop back. They have a discovered attack with d3, hitting our queen with the dark bishop. But we just simply slide the queen over to f5, and that's it. Game over. There is no way to attack the queen on this next move because the knight covers these two squares. On the very next move, white is going to lose their second knight, and the two rooks come off the board, and we have 1, 2, 3, 4 pieces to white's 2 bishops and a rook. So white is losing in all variations here. Black is completely dominating the board, not to mention the fact that their king is in the center. They cannot castle short easily, and it's going to take a while before they think about castling long. So black is crushing it here. So the engine says this is minus 3.4 for black. Okay, so the last line that I just showed you and this final line that I'm going to show you also stem from this variation called the Caro-Kane variation of the Caro-Kann Defense. No, I did not misspeak. I have not been drinking. That is a thing, the Caro-Kane variation. It was created by a national master named Jeremy Kane. And so it's you probably won't see this too often, but I had to include this in the video because it is part of these knight sacrifice lines. So going back to this spot, if they block with the queen, then this is really no attack for white. I mean, really this queen d5 move just kind of shuts everything down. So here we'll just, you could trade, but even better, we'll just take on c2. That's a free pawn. If they play d4, we just exchange queens and we take their knight, and that's it. Nothing else that white can do. And the engine says this is minus 3.4 for black. And ladies and gentlemen, that will wrap us up for this video. So we have talked about how to fight against the fantasy variation with the anti-fantasy. We have learned how to refute the Alien Gambit and a couple lines here with this Caro-Kane variation. So as always, I hope you guys enjoyed this, and please consider liking, subscribing, all of that good stuff. And we are getting close, guys. We got one more, the final 5th component of this masterclass series on the Caro-Kann with part E, which are going to be the 2 knights attack, and there's kind of just a bunch of offbeat sidelines, some kind of amateur beginner sidelines that we need to talk about in case you don't face any of these main lines. All right, take care for now, guys. Thanks so much.